I'm thinking of three poems which have nothing in common except that they're all short and they're all about death in one way or another, but in very different ways. The first poem is by an Englishman, the second by an American, the third poem is by an English-speaking Russian. I suppose if there were a contest for the title Poet of Death, Alfred Edward Housman would be a top contender, a very likely winner. His poems are loaded with allusions to death, sorrow, loss. So much so that somebody once wrote a little two-line parody of Housman that went like this. What? Still alive at 22? A fine, upstanding chap like you? Well, that parody does justice to Housman's usual choice of theme, but it does little justice to his style, which was marked by an unerring taste in the choice of words to convey whatever mood he wished to convey, whether it was extreme poignancy or extreme pungency and bitterness. He wrote poems of both kinds. The writing of poetry was a sideline with Housman. By calling, he was a scholar of the classics, a professor of Latin at University College London, later at Cambridge. He specialized in studies with the rather obscure Roman poet Manilius. But he did write verse, and in the 1890s he brought out a slender volume of his verse, published at his own expense. He called it A Shropshire Lad, and he brought it out under the pseudonym Terence Hearsay. It was loaded with allusions to death, sorrow, loss. And it did not do well. The public took little notice of it at the time, but a handful of years later, for some reason, in the early part of the 20th century, the public did begin to notice it, to buy it, to quote from it. It became famous and has remained so ever since. During his lifetime, Housman published only one other slender volume of his works. He called it Last Poems, loaded with the same themes as before. After Housman's death in 1936, his brother Lawrence brought together some of Alfred's unpublished verse and issued a third slender volume called More Poems. It's a poem from that volume that I'd like to share with you. As you'll see, it's on the pungent side rather than the poignant side. Like most of Housman's verse, it has no title. Good creatures, do you love your lives, and have you ears for sense? Here is a knife like other knives I bought for 18 pence. I need but stick it in my heart, and down will come the sky, and earth's foundations will depart, and all you folk will die. Robert Lee Frost is perhaps the most widely acclaimed American poet. He lived a long life, almost 90 he was when he died. He was a prolific poet. His collected works fill about 500 pages. Most of them project an image of rural or agricultural life in the northeastern states. But you would do wrong to pigeonhole Robert Frost as just a regional poet or a simple barefoot New England farm boy versifier. Robert Frost was, when he chose to be, one of the most subtle craftsmen that ever set pen to paper. And I think that is specially seen in the poem that we are going to look at. Frost's craftsmanship shows up in two different ways in this poem. One of them is sound, the way he uses sound. You'll be aware in hearing this poem that there's something about the sound that pulls you through the poem. And while I don't want to give away too many of the poet's tricks in advance, I think it is worthwhile taking a little look at how Frost is going to do this. The rhyme scheme of this poem is such that in each of the first three stanzas, we hear a rhyme sound that is going to be picked up and used again in the next following stanza. And this forms a sort of phonetic chain that pulls us through the poem. That's an old device. Dante had used it, or something very like it, 600 years before. Frost is using it with peculiar effectiveness in this poem. You might notice, too, that in the last stanza, the fourth stanza, all four rhyme sounds are identical, and in fact, as we'll hear, the last two lines are identical word for word. Yet we don't get any sense that the poet is just repeating himself when we hear that. A second subtle point about this poem is this. The poem is about death. It's even about the specious attractiveness which the idea of death can have for us in certain moods at certain times. Yet it never mentions death. It appears to be simply a poem about a man riding along through snow, riding on his horse and pausing momentarily to look at some woods. Not until the poem is completely done do you see what it is about. Let's have a look at Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. The third death poem is based on a concept of death so eccentric, so quirky, that I believe it could never have been written by anyone on earth except the man who did write it. Vladimir Vladimirovich Nabokov was surely one of the oddest writers whom this age or any age has produced. He's most famous for his rather scandalous novel Lolita, which has twice been made into a film. He wrote also a large number of other novels. He wrote a splendid autobiography called Speak Memory. recounting a childhood and youth spent in pre-revolutionary Russia, where he grew up trilingually, equally at home in the Russian, the English, and the French languages. On the disturbances following the Russian Revolution, his family emigrated to Western Europe, where he remained for a handful of years. During that time, he wrote various things, one of which, Anya v straně čudes, is a witty translation into Russian of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. About the time World War II broke out, Nabokov, who by then was married and had a son, moved to this country. All his life he had been an avid collector of butterflies and a serious scholar of lepidopterology. In this country he worked for a while at the American Museum of Natural History and at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology in classifying their butterfly collections. He wrote numerous technical papers on that subject, illustrated by his own drawings and paintings. He also mentions butterflies prominently in many of his fictional works. In fact, after his death, someone collected a volume of his writings on that subject. Nabokov's Butterflies contains all of Nabokov's allusions to butterflies, whether in technical papers or in his fictional works. It's a rather large volume. But to my mind, the most amazing thing that Nabokov wrote is the book Pale Fire. It's hard to describe this book. Its kernel or nucleus consists of a poem 999 lines long. Now, don't be concerned, that's not the poem that I mean to recite. But it has to be the best long poem in English ever written by a Russian, though in the book its authorship is ascribed to the fictitious poet John Shade. That's the kernel or nucleus of the book. The main body of the book is a series of notes and commentaries on the poem. Now, that sounds dull, doesn't it? Well, it isn't. Through some magic, some alchemy of which Nabokov was master, this unpromising material becomes a novel, a unique, highly interesting novel. Even its index, and it has one, is worth looking at. Many things are embedded in this novel. Among other things, a touching tribute to the Robert Frost poem, which we have just listened to. And that's interesting in itself because Nabokov did not find it easy to praise contemporary writers. Also embedded in the notes and commentaries part of Pale Fire are several short poems, again attributed to the fictitious John Shade. It's one of these that I'd like to share with you. Listen to The Nature of Electricity, and you will be admitted to the workings of one of the oddest, most eccentric minds that ever visited our planet. The dead, the gentle dead, who knows? In tungsten filaments abide, and on my bedside table glows another man's departed bride. And maybe Shakespeare floods a whole town with innumerable lights, and Shelley's incandescent soul lures the pale moths of starless nights. Street lamps are numbered, and maybe number 999, so brightly gleaming through a tree so green, is an old friend of mine. But when above the livid plain forked lightning plays, therein may dwell the torments of a Tamerlane, the roar of tyrants torn in hell.